Good morning, everyone. It seems like an age since I've spoken to you, and this will very likely be our last lesson that'll be uploaded onto YouTube, because as you will have seen in the email that you and your parents received, we're moving on to Microsoft Teams. We'll be doing our lessons live, and we will very likely pick that one up on Wednesday or so in the course of this week, and we'll continue like that. So this is our last one on YouTube. We'll also have moved a copy of this video into Teams if you want to listen to it again. So we pick up in chapter 4. Of course, chapter 3 having ended with the luncheon that Harry and Dorian attended, and we saw how Dorian was starting to mimic, if you like, Harry's attitudes and behavior, and we see right at the end of that chapter what seems to be becoming a more common thing for Dorian to do, to cancel on any engagements with Basil and to spend more and more of his time with Harry. And so in this chapter, of course, this conversation happens at Lord Henry's house in Mayfair. Now, Mayfair in London is what's a place like Santon would be to Johannesburg. It's one of your very affluent suburbs, and if you read in this first page of this chapter, you will see the reference to the decoration and the decor around the house. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but please just be aware that everything that is described there would be the equivalent of a brand name. Those would have been the designers of the day, and everything is about opulence and wealth, which again is testament to the upper classes of the Victorian era. So just on that first page, we get given a time frame. So this particular conversation happens a month after the luncheon at Lady Agatha, and that just gives you a sense of the passage of time. But what, of course, we read is, and we are halfway down page 54 now, Lord Henry had not yet come in. He was always late on principle, his principle being that punctuality is the thief of time. But once again, it speaks to Henry's attitude to others, his utter disrespect for other people's feelings, or just simply by honoring engagements. So again, it speaks to his character. Just underneath that, we see again the reference to Dorian's sulky, listless fingers. Again, just these little comments, little descriptions that give us insight into his character. I've just highlighted there the Louis XIV's clock. Again, every description of Henry's home is testament to his position in society. And then, of course, we come to meet Henry's wife. And you might have, as you read this chapter, given some thought to what you had expected his wife to be like. But she's quite an interesting character. We only meet her this once in the novel, but we learn just some interesting things about her, that she almost doesn't seem to match Henry, in that she is quite vivacious, and she's described as not being a fashionista. She's quite tatty, if you like, in her appearance. So just give some thought as to the description about her. And she, of course, comes in. Dorian expects it to be Henry, but we meet her. And we pick up now on, it's about 5 lines down on page 55. They're busy discussing Dorian's relationship with Henry, and she comments on how fascinated Henry is by Dorian, and of course we understand that fascination. And then the description of her. She laughed nervously as she spoke and watched him with her vague forget-me-not eyes. Forget-me-not would be a color. It's a blue, one of the blue colors. She was a curious woman whose dresses always looked as if they had been designed in a rage and put on in a tempest. She was usually in love with somebody, and as her passion was never returned, she had kept all her illusions. She tried to look picturesque, but only succeeded in being untidy. Her name was Victoria, and she had a perfect mania for going to church. So there's something again of the hypocrisy, of course, of the Victorian era in that reference to her passion for going to church. While she no doubt is playing the field, we've learnt earlier on in the novel that she and Henry have an open marriage. They see other people. And we learn here she's always in love with someone. So again, it speaks something to the hypocrisy of the Victorian era. And then just that description of her, the very interesting description, which suggests someone different. She is not refined, it would seem, although she's of the upper classes. Henry would certainly never have married anyone beneath him. But just an interesting description of her. And then they have this conversation a little bit further down, and it's the beginning of the last paragraph on page 55. Dorian makes a comment, and he says that he doesn't talk during music unless it's bad music, and he wants to drown it out. And her response is, that is one of Harry's views, isn't it, Mr. Gray? I always hear Harry's views from his friends. Now, of course, the significance of that statement is, again, the reference to the influence that Harry has on other people, that they pick up his views, they pick up his habits, they pick up his opinions, and they all seem to mimic him, except, of course, for Basil, as we have seen earlier on. And we learn later on in the chapter, in the next couple of pages, of course, how Dorian absolutely mimics Henry. He begins to speak like him. He starts to use aphorisms in the same way that Henry uses them. Usually they will be aphorisms that he has picked up from Henry. His bad habits now are like Henry's. His disregard for others is like Henry's. And he is almost becoming like a clone of Henry. And of course, that's important because that is Henry giving Dorian his soul, as we saw in chapter 2. So it's quite important. Victoria is aware of his influence over others. It also speaks, of course, to their marriage, that she never gets to hear of Harry's opinions from himself because they are never together, it would seem, that they live these separate lives, and their view of marriage is very different to what would be regarded as a traditional view of marriage. And that's picked up again further on when Henry does eventually deign to arrive. And page 56, it's about halfway down, she excuses herself and she makes this comment to Henry. She says, "Goodbye, Henry. You are dining out, I suppose? So am I. Perhaps I shall see you at Lady Thornbury's." So there's this complete disconnect in their marriage, it would seem, that they are really just passing ships in the night, and that is as much as the marriage means to them. A little bit further, we see again another description of her. I'm not going to spend any time on it, but it's just interesting, the kind of woman that she is. And then, of course, we discover the reason why Dorian is here at all. And he informs Henry that he is in love. And we discover, of course, that she is Sybil Vane. Now, you will have seen in that worksheet that I sent to you last night that you need to develop the a character sketch on Sybil Vane. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on summarizing who she is. I'd rather that you just do that on your own. I want to have a look at Dorian himself and how Dorian develops as a character here. All right, so he informs Henry that he is in love, and Henry speaks about the fact that he makes a comment on marriage as Victoria is leaving, and we're picking it up on the bottom of page 56. He says, "Never marry at all, Dorian. Men marry because they are tired. Women because they are curious. Both are disappointed." So again, this comment about his and Victoria's marriage and his cynicism about relationships. Dorian then informs him, "I don't think I'm likely to marry Henry. I am too much in love. That is one of your aphorisms. I'm putting it into practice as I do everything that you say." There's the clone. And of course, Henry absolutely revels in it. He then informs Henry that the woman that he is in love with is an actress, and and Henry's reaction is so condescending, and he says to him, "That is a rather commonplace debut." So, it's important that you look at the relationship between Dorian and Henry. Henry doesn't really care about Dorian. He just wants all this excitement, the hedonism for Dorian, and he thinks, oh no, what is he going to get out of this relationship? Not for a moment does he actually think about Dorian's feelings and that Dorian really is in love. Anyway, he asks who she is. And we've moved on to page 57, and we are informed that her name is Sybil Vane. Look now at Henry's response. You're about 8 lines down on page 57. Dorian says her name is Sybil Vane. Henry, never heard of her. Now, it's important, that reaction, because again, it speaks to him. It speaks to that it's, you need to have the who's who in your life. You need to be out there in society in order to pursue hedonism. And of course, Dorian is offended, and he describes her as a genius. And then we get Henry's reaction. "My dear boy, no woman is a genius. Women are a decorative sex. They never have anything to say, but they say it charmingly. Women represent the triumph of matter over mind, just as men represent the triumph of mind over morals." Now, you will have seen in your notes that I sent you last night, I gave you there a definition of misogyny. So it's this prejudice towards women, and Henry is a misogynist through and through. Track his attitude towards women from the beginning to the end of the novel, and you will see his sexism. He is condescending. He thinks women have no value other than to give pleasure. Essentially, in his mind, women are to be seen and not heard. We looked at his idea of beauty, and that you should pursue beautiful things that would include beautiful women, and we see that attitude all the way through the novel. Now, of course, remember, he is representative of the upper classes of Victorian society, so his attitude, to all intents and purposes, is the attitude of the Victorians, and this is in the absolute infancy of women's rights beginning to be protested and fought for in England. So it's right in the early stages of that. But generally the attitude to women was absolutely condescending. They had very, very few rights and very little value in society other than to be decorative, as he suggests. And he says that men represent the triumph of mind over morals. Now, that's important in the sense that he regards himself as a scientist. Remember, this is the development of science. And he sees, that women are the triumph of matter over mind. Men represent triumph of mind over morals. So he sees women as having absolutely no consequence. Further down, he carries on. And he says, there are only two kinds of women, the plain and the coloured. The plain are very useful. If you want to gain a reputation for respectability, you have merely to take them down to supper. The other women are very charming. They commit one mistake, however. They paint in order to try and look young. He's making a reference there to makeup, women wearing makeup. And he carries on, our grandmothers painted to try and, I've just lost my place there. Our grandmothers painted in order to try and talk brilliantly. Rouge and esprit used to go together, esprit meaning charm. So again, this very condescending attitude, the misogynist in Henry. So that's some things to start looking out for as the novel carries on. Dorian's reaction, Henry, your views terrify me. But of course, he still emulates them and he still copies them. And once we get to the next chapter where his relationship with Sybil develops, it's important to be aware of how his attitudes have changed. We learn that the relationship is very new. It's 3 weeks old, and that, of course, is very significant when you get to the end of the chapter, and we are informed that he and Sybil have become engaged. And then Dorian goes on to say, and we are now on page 58. And he says to Henry, I will tell you, Harry, but you mustn't be unsympathetic about it. After all, it never would have happened if I had not met you. You filled me with a wild desire to know everything about life. So, of course, this alludes back to the encounter in Basil's garden, right on the first day that Henry and Dorian meet, and Henry introduces him to hedonism. But we see here that this has developed over the course of time, that Henry has almost coached Dorian into this. And so he describes how it is that he comes to meet Sybil. And we are about halfway down page 58 now. He says, I fancied 1,000 things. The mere danger gave me a sense of delight. I remembered what you had said to me on that wonderful evening when we first dined together about the search for beauty being the real secret of life. I don't know what I expected, but I went out and wandered eastward, soon losing my way in a labyrinth of grimy streets and black grassless squares. Now, it's important again that he goes to the East End of London. I spoke quite extensively about that in the previous chapter, but he goes to, if you like, the sort of seedy part of town to look for pleasure. For two reasons. We see it much later in the novel as well, but one is that he believes that that's where immoral things happen, and that is what Henry has coached him to pursue, but also, of course, where he won't be seen if he is getting up to immoral activities. Now, what's important in this chapter, again, it's so important that you keep note of this as you read, is diction. Look at the use of diction, the labyrinth. So labyrinth is a whole lot of confused, muddled up, jumbled up streets, if you like, almost like a maze. There's no order or structure to them. The streets are described as grimy, black, grassless squares. And then he comes across the theatre. And we are introduced here to another attitude in Victorian society, and that is the attitude of anti-Semitism. So you will have seen I've given you a little bit of history there in the notes that I sent you last night. But it was very, very common for the Londoners to be very, very anti-Semitic. They were anti the Jews, and of course they were largely immigrants who had come through from Russia. This would have been the time when Russia would have been very, very unstable, and you had all these people fleeing Russia. This is prior to the Russian Revolution. If any of you know the history of the Russian Revolution, so this is leading up to the Russian Revolution, and these Jewish people came and they settled largely in the East End of London. They were very poor, had no rights, and they lived in these very, very crowded and squalid conditions. So have a look at how he describes the manager of the theatre. He says, "A hideous Jew in the most amazing waistcoat I ever beheld in my life was standing at the entrance smoking a vile cigar." Look at the adjectives that have been used. Hideous. The vile cigar. He had greasy ringlets and an enormous diamond blazed in the center of a soiled shirt. Look at how he absolutely looks down on him by the way that he is described. Later on, he describes gorgeous servility. Servility comes from the word servant. So he would have been referring to the idea that this man is beneath him. Couple of lines down, he was such a monster. Can you see the prejudice there in the way that he describes him before he goes into the theatre, and he's drawn into the theatre? And then he says at the end of the paragraph, "If I hadn't, I should have missed the greatest romance of my life." Look at his observation of Henry's reaction. "I see you are laughing." Can you see Henry? He's not interested. He's horrible to Dorian at this particular point. Top of page 59, we're about 5 lines in. He says to him, "You should say the first romance," so he corrects him, not the greatest. "You will always be loved, and you will always be in love with love." In other words, love is not about commitment. It's not about two people relating to each other. It's a sensation that you pursue. You will always be in love with love. You pursue the sensation. It's an act of hedonism as far as Henry is concerned. It's not an act of relationship. And he says a grande passion is the privilege of people who have nothing to do. All right. A little bit further down, he says to him, we're about halfway down page 59, "Faithfulness is to the emotional life what consistency is to the life of the intellect, simply a confession of failures." Again, can you see the attitude? He's not interested in relationship. He's interested in the sensation of it. Right, and once again, I've just highlighted them in purple for you, and you can have a look at them. Do yourselves a favor, do a little bit of an exercise on diction here. It's really, really some lovely expressions with which you can explore diction. The horrid, vulgar, tawdry, dingy, all of these words that create an atmosphere for us. And then just a comment at the end of that paragraph. It's the end of the second last paragraph on page 59. He's describing the theatre. He says, women went about with oranges and ginger beer, and there was a terrible consumption of nuts going on. And I can't help wondering if this isn't a reference to the peanut gallery from Shakespearean times. If you recall, when you started studying Shakespeare, and I'm sure you would have had to do some sort of research into him and into the Globe Theatre, of course, the peanut gallery was the standing room. And traditionally, people would have, it was known as the peanut gallery because that's what people ate while they were watching. And I can't help wondering if this isn't an allusion to that, again, to show his condescension, that these people are beneath him, and that he really didn't feel as if he belonged there. Then, of course, he informs Henry that the play that was being performed on that particular night was Romeo and Juliet. It's significant. We know the story of Romeo and Juliet. We know it's a tragic love story. We know it's forbidden love. And of course that Romeo and Juliet came from opposing houses and therefore were not allowed to love each other. And one can't help wondering at the choice of play that Oscar Wilde makes here, that it's Romeo and Juliet, because we're going to look as the chapter progresses at how the relationship between Dorian and Sybil Vane is doomed before it even starts. And one of the contributors to its tragic end, of course, is their class distinction, that they come literally from complete opposite classes, and already that tells us it can't work. But there are so many other things that that show us, that indicate to us that this relationship is absolutely bound for a tragic end. He goes on to describe it, just highlighted in pink there again, the anti-Semitism, the way he describes the pianist, why it would matter what the nationality of the person playing the piano was, is questionable in today's society, but he makes a point, and he refers to him as a young Hebrew. And then he describes the different actors. I'm not going to dwell on those at all, but then finally we come to meet, I nearly called her Juliet, we come to meet Sybil herself. And he gives us her age, and look again at the way she is described. Now, the way she is described is important, not because it tells us what she looks like, but it tells us what Dorian is looking at, and therefore why this relationship is doomed. So we learn her age. Look at some of the adjectives: flower-like face, Greek head. The Greeks were renowned in ancient Greece for their beauty. The dark brown eyes, violet wells of passion for her eyes. Her lips, petals of a rose. She was the loveliest thing. Can you see what he's attracted to her? He's attracted to her beauty. Then he says a little bit further that Harry had told him that beauty can move you to tears, and he explains to him that he was moved to tears. Then he goes on to describe her voice. Deep, mellow notes sounded like a flute. And then he describes the garden scene, of course, where they meet, as tremulous ecstasy. And then he says there were moments later on when it had the wild passion of violence. You know how a voice can stir one. Your voice and the voice of Sybil Vane are two things I shall never forget. Can you see that his falling in love with Sybil is a sensory experience? It's not a relationship. He goes on to say, she is everything to me in life. One evening, she is Rosalind, and the next evening, she is Imogen. And then he goes on to describe the other characters that she plays. And this is really, really important because he's fallen in love with the characters, not the person playing the characters. He's fallen in love with her beauty, not her personality. This relationship is doomed. About halfway down page 61, he says, ordinary women never appeal to one's imagination. They are limited to their century. So what he means by that is she can play the woman of any century, and that makes her extraordinary. But the question then has to be asked, what is he in love with? Is he in love with the characters? The Imogens and the Rosalinds and the Juliets, not with Sybil herself. Of course, Harry just sort of poo-poos the whole thing, and he says, you know, an actress, we are round about 2/3 of the way down page 61. He says, an actress, how different an actress is. Harry, why didn't you tell me that the only thing worth loving is an actress? And again, he's not in love with the person because she's playing different roles. And then, of course, Henry is again, he's you know, well, I've just loved so many actresses, Dorian, I can't be bothered. He can't connect with Dorian. He can't be happy for Dorian. He's got to put him down, if you like. And he speaks about them with their dyed hair and their painted faces. And Dorian says, well, he wishes he hadn't told him about Sybil Vane. And Henry's response is really important. It's about 8 lines up from the bottom of page 61. He says, you could not have helped telling me, Dorian. All through your life, you will tell me everything you do. Can you see the control? We spoke about the predator earlier. He controls Dorian. He's a puppet to him. As the chapter develops, of course, we'll look at how he sees him as an experiment. I'm not going to dwell on that today. We're going to end it just in a moment. But the control, you'll tell me everything. Now, of course, that doesn't become entirely true as the novel develops, and there's a turning point in the novel that we'll look at where Dorian just goes his own way and does his own thing. It's almost as if the experiment is complete and it has a life of its own. Remember, this is Victorian literature, not unlike Frankenstein, of course, who becomes his own monster, and he's no longer controllable. And so we just carry on from there. He says, yes, Harry, I believe that is true, that he'll tell him everything. I cannot help telling you things. You have a curious influence over me. If I ever did a crime, I would come and confess it to you. You would understand me. Foreshadowing. And we'll explore that later. People like you, the willful sunbeams of life, don't commit crimes, Dorian. But I am much obliged for the compliment all the same. Remember that when he does make the closest he will ever come to a confession at the end, towards the end of the novel, Henry says to him, you're too beautiful to commit a crime. And he doesn't believe him. And then, of course, he says, well, what are your actual relationships with Sybil Vane? In other words, he wants to know whether he slept with her. and Dorian Gray's reaction. Dorian Gray leapt to his feet with flushed cheeks and burning eyes. Harry, Sybil Vane is sacred. And that is the second paragraph on page 62. So I want you to think about, for our next lesson, why it is, I've mentioned some of the things, but why it is that the relationship between Sybil and Dorian is doomed. Think about this expression, Sybil Vane is sacred. Why in itself will this phrase doom the relationship, this attitude, this feeling that Dorian has to her? So we're going to leave it there, and I will hopefully be with you live on Wednesday or Thursday or so. You will be receiving a schedule in the next couple of days, just to inform you that we'll have to schedule times now for lessons. So I will hopefully have you in a somewhat live virtual classroom, and we'll engage like that for the rest of the chapter. In the meantime, have a look at the summaries I've asked you to make on the worksheet that I've given you, and start thinking about those, start working on them. I have uploaded a highlighted PDF onto Teams. If you look under classroom materials, you'll be able to find it there if you want to recheck some of the highlighted pieces from chapter 4. I will see you in one way or another later on in the week. Thanks very much. Bye.